everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the very Cold Lasagna podcast, your filthy casual place for all the filthy casual takes on the world of sports. I am DylanLasagna, and welcome back to another episode of this icy yet spicy podcast, however you may be consuming it, whether it's on YouTube or on the audio side of things. And this is episode number 133, and boy, we got another good one for you all today because we are continuing along as we enter a new month, but we still have some things to cover in part 2 of our 2022 NFL season recap month. That is right. We ended the month of February, kicking off our season recap month as, well, we began season recap month with the 6 absolutely worst teams in the NFL. Well, who were those 6 teams? Well, just to give you a little bit of a debrief, those 6 teams were the Chicago Bears, the Houston Texans, the Arizona Cardinals, the Indianapolis Colts, the Denver Broncos, and the Los Angeles Rams. So if you want to know my full thoughts on each of those teams, the stories that were told, and what I thought each team needs to do this offseason, which, by the way, starts, I believe, next week, if I'm correct, when the new league year starts, what they need to do this offseason to maybe either like take a next step forward or maybe even an immediate step forward to their ultimate goal, whatever that may be. Then you want to know my full thoughts? Go back and listen, consume that episode, and then come back to this one because there's a lot of teams left to cover here in season recap month of Very Cold Lasagna. And part 2, there's a lot of 7 and 10ers, a lot of mediocrity. I gotta say, yes, a lot of mediocrity in this episode. Not in terms of, this podcast is mediocre. Well, it all depends on how you think of it. No. Part 2 of NFL season recap month, there's a lot of stench of mediocre teams. I say that, well, there's a lot of teams that went 7 and 10, either because, well, they were just not good, not great, but they also weren't terrible. They were just, they were just meh. They were just mid. So, yeah, that's what we're going to be talking about here in episode 133 of this podcast here today. Obviously, before we do, make sure you listen to the show, follow the show on social media, on Twitter and Instagram at Very Cold Lasagna. Make sure you leave a comment, subscribe, like, rate, and review the show, all that good stuff. So with that being said, let's waste no more time, shall we? We got 6 more teams to cover in this episode in our season recaps. So with that being said, let's get on with the first team of season recaps. So kicking things off with part 2 of our 2022 NFL season recaps is, well, a team some of you may be familiar with. We're going to be taking a trip down to Sin City before we go into the land of mediocrity, the land of 7 and 10s. But before we do, we got to take a trip down to Sin City and visit the Silver and Black. Yes, I'm talking about the Las Vegas Raiders. For the Raiders, obviously going into 2022, they were coming off one of the most interesting seasons in 2021, in my opinion at least. You had the John Gruden email leaks and then the Henry Ruggs arrest/release affecting the team on all fronts mid-season, physically, emotionally, mentally, and then interim head coach Rich Bisaccia rallies the troops. They win 4 straight games to make the playoffs, including that crazy ending to the whole season last year. And they actually managed to nearly upset Joe Burrow and the Bengals in the first round of the AFC playoffs. Sure, they didn't win the game, but you saw how motivated they were to try and win that game against Cincinnati. But Rich Bisaccia wasn't retained. He wasn't promoted as the permanent head coach. So Mark Davis elected to hire Josh McDaniels as the newest head coach of the Raiders during the last offseason. And, at the time, it seemed like a fine decision. Perhaps maybe he could get the best out of quarterback Derek Carr, who's had a lot of limitations in his decade of being in the NFL. And along with bringing along Josh McDaniels, you're bringing in a new general manager in Dave Ziegler, who got feisty in free agency. You're bringing a linebacker from Arizona in free agency in Chandler Jones. And you make this massive trade to bolster the offense that was kind of missing that number one receiver. And you do so by getting a big piece in the Green Bay Packers receiver, Davante Adams. You steal him away. You snatch him away from Green Bay. You snatch away Aaron Rodgers' big weapon, and you reunite him with his college weapon, his college guy, Derek Carr. So you all of a sudden have an offense that has Davante Adams, Hunter Renfrow, Josh Jacobs, and Darren Waller. It seemed like a pretty good offense that could be a problem in the AFC West. The only question that had to be answered was, well, could Derek Carr take advantage of that offense? And, well, a lot of that was not necessarily answered throughout the 2022 season. And to be honest with you, the Raiders, you saw flashes of how well the offense could be at times, except they just couldn't get out of their own way for a good bunch of it. You start the season having a shaky outing against the LA Chargers, and you have a solid home opener against the Arizona Cardinals, but then it turns into a complete disaster because you choke away a sizable 20-0 lead, and then you lose 29-23 in overtime in what served to be what was to come for Josh McDaniels' Raiders. So, yeah, that overtime loss where they were up 20-0 against Arizona, it was not good. It was not good. A lot of bad management by McDaniels, a lot of conservative calling, and unfortunately, there was a lot of it. And it ended up being more of that. So the Raiders started 0-3. They managed to beat Denver because Denver sucks in week 4 in a game where Josh McDaniels seemed to have figured out his offensive game plan. Feed Josh Jacobs. Because honestly, 4 weeks in, Derek Carr wasn't, not really lighting the world on fire. But despite the new game plan, the choking continued. They blew double-digit leads to the Chiefs and the Jaguars. Sandwiched in between those losses were a shutout loss in New Orleans and an embarrassment at the hands of Jeff Saturday's Colts in his first ever game. Mid-season, mind you. Like, it doesn't get any more embarrassing for the silver and black, And by that point, they were 2-7. And a good amount of that was, because Josh McDaniels couldn't really take advantage. He couldn't really game plan around his offense. He really couldn't get the best out of Derek Carr. And, Derek Carr, he also couldn't really, figure out the defenses. He couldn't really get aggressive like he did in the later half of the 2021 season. So the Raiders made one last desperate attempt at a wildcard berth, winning their next 4 or 5 games. But it was kind of too little too late by that point. And the last victory, I think it was week 15, it was pretty much gifted to them because that was primarily to Jacoby Myers being a dumbass and literally battling a ball back to Chandler Jones. And we all remember how that went. We all remember how that went against the Patriots. Unfortunately for Las Vegas, they rode the high of that luck too much. They lost another winnable game against the Pittsburgh Steelers on Christmas Eve. And then that's when the Raiders decided that, you know what? We're going to shut down Derek Carr. We finally had enough of him. Maybe a little too late for that, despite giving him a big fat contract. But hey, I guess better late than never, I guess. So they would end the season 6-11, and then the inevitable would come to fruition 2 days after the Super Bowl, after Derek Carr absolutely refused a trade anywhere. And the Raiders would release Derek Carr before a big chunk of money of guarantees would kick in. So, yeah, for the Raiders, it was absolutely a disappointing season after a kind of inspiring season from the year prior. So where did things go wrong for Las Vegas? Well, they blew at least 5 double-digit leads this past season, and they lost a lot of one-score games. Like I said, primarily due to how conservative and how complacent Josh McDaniels' play calling was. After they got up to such a big lead, like, you have to keep scoring, you have to keep attacking. Yes, Derek Carr is pretty limited. He keeps deferring to the check down. He kind of was also missing like Hunter Renfrow and Darren Waller for half of the year with serious injuries. But still, you have your top weapon in Devontae Adams, and he couldn't really take advantage of that. But at the same time, it's like Josh McDaniels was really complacent with his calls when they were up so big. And yeah, going back to Derek Carr, yeah, he turned it over more and more as well. He threw it less as well, and he completed less of his passes. So for Derek, he'll probably get a starting job elsewhere on a team that's really desperate to get a quarterback. But I really hope teams realize that he's going to have to earn his payday. I really do. But on a positive note, I guess, you had edge rusher Max Crosby and Josh Jacobs had Pro Bowl type years. Josh Jacobs, at least for this year, he showed that he can be a quality back when he's healthy and paid as such. But who knows? Just hope that the Raiders don't overpay him. But overall, though, I mean, it can't be understated that coming off an inspiring late season run from last season, it was followed up with a disappointing campaign in this one. So for the Raiders, after you release Derek Carr, you got a shit ton of money to work with. You have around like $46 million at the time of this recording. Maybe they'll get even more if they either restructure some contracts, if they can, or you release some other players as well. And then you hold the 7th overall pick in the NFL draft. So maybe in an ideal spot to get a quarterback, whichever one's the best one, or maybe you make a trade up with the Bears or whoever to get the guy you want, the best one out there. But you do have to make some key decisions on who you want to keep around, because you do have a couple of unrestricted free agents, especially Josh Jacobs. Since you didn't pick up his 5th-year option, you do have to sign him to a big fat contract if they want to. That's the thing, if they want to. And then there are some other like key free agents like Matt Collins, Jermaine Ilunimore, if I'm pronouncing that right, Foster Moreau, Rock Yassin, and even backup quarterback Jared Stidham. I mean, are they going to keep him around? That's something to answer as well. Obviously, the biggest thing to address in this offseason is getting a quarterback. I do think that using that 7th overall pick, or maybe even higher, is where the Raiders need to use that pick to get a quarterback. Like I said, it can be anybody, just as long as Dave Ziegler scouts well and gets that right quarterback. They need to use whatever pick they need in the top 10, whether it's at 7 or if they trade up to go get their guy, to draft the best remaining quarterback prospect. And then you do have to beef up the interior defensive line to support Max Crosby and Chandler Jones, because outside of those two on the edge, there wasn't really much help in the interior in terms of the pass rush. So, now that both the Raiders and Derek Carr have gone their separate ways, the Raiders kind of have to nail most, if not all, this offseason. Like I said, they have a good amount of cap space. They have a high draft pick. It's just a matter if Mark Davis and Dave Ziegler really are interested in, going and getting a really good quarterback prospect in this draft. If not, then, well, there are QB options in the free agency market. It's just a matter of picking the right one. Now, there are some speculators, out there that are saying like, oh, let's have the Raiders go and get Aaron Rodgers. It's like, does Aaron Rodgers really want to play in Las Vegas? Even with his buddy Devontae Adams there? Really? I don't know. So, the Raiders have to at least get the quarterback position right, whether it's in free agency or in the draft. I personally think it's the draft. But if they can't get that part right, then why even take a gamble in Sin City if you're an NFL player? I'm just saying. So next up in part 2 of our season recaps, we're going to be talking about some dirty birds. And that is, of course, the Atlanta Falcons. The Atlanta Falcons, they went 7-10 last year, but a lot of people like me thought that the Atlanta Falcons were going to be one of those bottom-feeding teams this past season and competing for, at least the first, second, or third overall pick in this upcoming draft. I personally predicted them to win a minimum of 3 games. Yes. Those were my expectations from back in July. A lot of reasoning for that was because, they got rid of long-time but aging starter Matt Ryan. And, they didn't really have an answer at quarterback. They got Marcus Mariota in last offseason, and they also drafted in the third round, Desmond Ridder from Cincinnati. But you didn't really see a lot from Desmond Ridder in Cincinnati, even though he, out of the weak quarterback class from that draft, he seemed like the most kind of ready-ish in terms of that weak QB class. But even then, you still had a roster that was still ripe with short-term options all around due to their limited salary cap. And overall, this basically was supposed to be like year one of a rebuild-ish, trying to establish a culture under second-year head coach Arthur Smith. And, perhaps maybe even trying to know if Desmond Ridder could be a long-term option for them. Well, looking at this 2022 for Atlanta, I guess you could say half of that worked out for them. Maybe? You tell me. Because, despite the already mentioned roster issues, Arthur Smith and his staff, he somehow made the most of it again, especially on offense. Marcus Mariota looked okay for the first half of the year, and at times, it looked like he could resurge back into the player that he was when he was a rookie with the Tennessee Titans. But again, he had those moments where he turned the ball over. And then the running game was probably perhaps the biggest positive of this group. When Cordell Patterson was, he was the engine of the offense yet again. But when he was out with injury, and even when he came back from injury, it was the backup running backs of Caleb Huntley and Tyler Algier that did really well. And Algier managed to rush really well. And even had a couple of 100-yard games as well. Rookie receiver Drake London performed really well. He with great speed, reached for the ball. Perhaps maybe he could be one of the top receivers in the league. But maybe that's a bit of a stretch. And this is despite not having Kyle Pitts for much of the season. And that's kind of unfortunate for them. The offensive line, though, it still had its patches, but right tackle Karen McGarry, center Drew Dalman, they did well in run blocking and pass protecting, something that Atlanta has lacked in the last few years. Chris Lindstrom also got a Pro Bowl nod. Defensively, there's a lot of areas of improvement. The pass rush, defensive end Grady Jarrett didn't really get much help. Inside linebacker Rashawn Evans and corner AJ Terrell, they were kind of like swarms, in the Hornets' nest. Made really good plays, but outside of that, not really much else. It just felt like Atlanta could use a couple more starting pieces to support their good players. And, look at their season as a whole. They overcame an 0-2 start to the season, played some good football against, actual playoff contenders, like against the Seattle Seahawks and the 49ers. And they even cut it close to Tom Brady and the Bucs at one point early in the season. And what ended up being a very weak NFC South. They even surpassed the Bucs at one point because they were playing so bad. The Bucs were playing so bad. So, yeah, it looked like at one point the Falcons were actually going to win the division, but they went 4-4 at the midway point, and they started falling apart after they lost a heartbreaker to the Chargers, and they were embarrassed in prime time by the Panthers. And a lot of that had to do with the inconsistency of Marcus Mariota and his limitations glaring up again. So after their bye week, Arthur Smith elected to bench Mariota for Desmond Ridder. He was pretty much like phoning in the season, and he wanted to see what Ridder had to offer. I mean, for Ridder, he looked rough in the games that he played because when you start your rookie, like literally 4 games in, with 4 games left of the season, of course he's going to look rough, because you didn't start him earlier, because I don't know why you didn't. But anyway, against the Bucs backups, he looked a little bit cleaner. He also threw his first and second touchdowns of his career. So, I mean, you can't necessarily go into 2023 like with committing to Ridder too much. You might need another option at QB, but overall, Atlanta went 7-10 again in 2022, but they're dead last in what was a putrid division. But I don't know. What can you really make of it? What can you really make of this team right now? I mean, yeah, they were in a putrid division. They almost could have won a putrid division, but this could either be a launching pad for what's to come, or maybe not, because with the Bucs perhaps blowing things up, it can be wide open. Things can be wide open for Atlanta in the NFC South, depending on how things play out for the front office. And they have a good amount of money to spend this offseason and a top draft pick. Let's get into that right now. So the Falcons have a solid amount of money to spend. They have around $56 million to spend, and they have the 8th overall pick in the NFL draft, if I'm correct. So not a bad idea. Not a bad ideal plan for the Falcons this coming offseason. And looking at some of the key free agents, not too many to note of other than Rashaan Evans and Isaiah Oliver at corner. And I guess Bradley Pinion. Niners fans may be familiar with them. And looking at some of your needs to address this offseason, obviously the 2 big names you want to re-sign are the ones I just named, Rashaan Evans and Isaiah Oliver. And then you want to use perhaps the NFL draft, maybe not your first round pick, but maybe the later rounds of the draft, whatever you have, to stock up on defense. Maybe you could find somebody in the later rounds to bolster up your defense. And then you want to answer the question maybe at number 8, or maybe in the second round. Do you want to grab another quarterback? Do you want to invest that high in grabbing a long-term answer quarterback? Because again, you don't really know what you have in Desmond Ridder yet. And maybe you want Ridder to compete with somebody. We'll see. And then obviously you want to retool the offensive line because, they were okay in pass protection, but always want to have competition up front. And you always want to protect your quarterback. So for Desmond Ridder, obviously you only have much of a sample size with the final 4 games that he played, but I think that the Falcons should bring in a little bit of competition for him. If the Falcons believe he can be their long-term starter, then again, bring in some competition for him. Use this offseason to fill a good amount of their key areas. And unlike years past, they have the cap space. They have 9 picks in this NFL draft. So the front office and the coaching staff have plenty to work with. And if they're able to attract quality players, both in free agency and the draft, and whichever quarterback shows good offseason progress, then who knows? The NFC South just might be theirs for the taking. So next up, we're going to take a trip down to the Big Easy, which actually ended up being the Big Hard. And that is, of course, talking about the New Orleans Saints. So for the Saints, last 2021, they went 9-8. They nearly eked out a wild card spot. Almost took that away from the San Francisco 49ers. But they lost out due to tiebreakers and stuff. So for the Saints, they were beginning a completely new era in 2022. Drew Brees already retired after the 2020 season, and you had longtime head coach Sean Payne step down 2 weeks after the 2021 season ended. So in came defensive coordinator Dennis Allen, getting promoted to head coach. But obviously, when I talked about Dennis Allen when I was previewing the Saints season, I had plenty of questions. Despite having a solid roster when it came to Dennis Allen, because when Dennis Allen was coaching the Oakland Raiders, he didn't exactly do that well during his tenure. He went, I think, an abysmal 2-14. He had a really bad losing record, and he didn't. I think he only lasted a season and a half, if I remember correctly. Someone back me up on that. So you had some questions on how he would fare in his second coaching gig. And you also had questions about when Jameis Winston and receiver Michael Thomas would be healthy enough to play coming off their injuries. Jameis Winston coming off a torn ACL, and Michael Thomas, he's been battling like leg injuries like for the last season and a half. So a lot of questions for the Saints to answer. And, a lot of those questions were actually answered only a month in. For the Saints, they looked good on both ends on offense in the first game of the Falcons. Winston looked productive. He looked like the same productive version that he was prior to the ACL injury the season prior. And Michael Thomas, he looks pretty solid, shaking off that rust. He was Winston's preferred receiver in what was a fourth quarter comeback against Atlanta. And then you had others like Taysom Hill, Jarvis Landry, Chris Olave, Alvin Kamara producing as well. And when you look at the Saints in that game, it seemed like they could have been an offensively solid team. But then you remember, it was only week 1. Because after that game, Winston reverted back to throwing interceptions and against the Bucs and the Panthers. And then when you look at it, well, a good reason for that was, he was playing through back fractures that he suffered in that first game against the Falcons. So that affected his ability to throw. So, and here comes Andy Dalton now take over the starting spot from week 4 onwards. And, let's just say that he didn't play terrible, but he also didn't play great. He was just very mid. The play was so conservative that it pretty much limited the offense. It was limited to just checkdowns, occasional mid-range and deep ball throws. Pretty much, plays like expected from Andy Dalton at in his mid-30s. So, like I said, it pretty much limited what the offense was able to do, especially when they were playing from behind. When the Saints were playing from behind, it's like not the best situation you want to be in. So, on a positive note, though, their defense kept them in a good amount of the games, especially when you have players like Cameron Jordan, Marcus Davenport, and linebacker Demario Davis, and new safety Tyrann Mathieu. But the problem was the offense. It's an offense-driven league, and when the offense is capped at the ceiling with Andy Dalton, it would undo you in those very tight games. And they also had a lot of injuries to a good amount of its key players that did them in. You only had Michael Thomas for 3 games. Starting corners Marshawn Lattimore and Bradley Roby missed a good amount of time. Lattimore didn't come back until week 17 when they beat the Eagles. So they were missing a good amount of key players. So for the Saints, even despite all of that, they actually were still in the fight for the NFC South because they were playing in a putrid, crappy division. That is the NFC South, thanks primarily to the Bucs being total dog shit. So the Saints actually had as much of an opportunity to steal it, but again, they weren't that great. They weren't terrible either, but it was just their problems that I already talked about. It just didn't help them at all. And, they got upset win over the Eagles, albeit they didn't have Jalen Hurts. But after what happened already around the league, they were already eliminated from playoff contention for the second straight year, and they ended their season at 7-10. So overall, they had a very limited ceiling in 2022, especially offensively. But at least, rookie receiver Chris Olave looked pretty good, pretty efficient. But the problem was, other than that offense did not look great. Did not. It was pretty capped when you had Andy Dalton at the helm. And you didn't even bother. Dennis Allen didn't really bother to try Jameis Winston. Even when he was already fully healthy again. After, I think it was like week 6 when he was fully healthy, ready to go. Not even a hinge. So now the Saints are kind of in that purgatory. They're not bad, but they're not good either. They're like in that neutral zone of, well, shit, we're kind of stuck here. And that's kind of going to continue for perhaps even next season, which sucks for them, especially considering their offseason. It's like, what can they even really do? What can the Saints really even do? They're way in the red with their cap space. They're at this time, they're like $44 million over the cap. So they owe a lot of money. And how are they going to restructure some of their contracts? And they have a couple of key free agents like Marcus Davenport, Jarvis Landry, Bradley Roby, backup running back Mark Ingram. So it's like, if they want to keep any of them, it's like, how are you going to plan to? And I think Jameis Winston is also a free agent. So, man, it's like, how are you going to, what are you going to do here? And some of the things that you have to address in free agency and the draft is well, the first thing you got to do is find a way to get under the salary cap. Again, you got to work that magic, man. So after you do that, it's like, you got to find some cheap defensive linemen to re-strengthen that pass rush. Like I said, you're probably going to lose Marcus Davenport. And at this point, you got to find something in the draft to rebolster that pass rush. And then I'm going to retract the Jameis Winston thing because he actually has one more year left on his deal, and thus the Saints just outright release him. But maybe the Saints can use their second round pick on a quarterback, whatever is good on day 2, to compete with Jameis Winston. Because, well, it's like, you can't really sign anybody on the open market. Andy Dalton's a free agent. Jimmy Garoppolo, for example, is going to be, for some reason, overpriced as hell. So just bring in a quarterback, second round. Maybe he'll pan out. Hopefully. So for the Saints, it wasn't an entirely bad 2022, but again, they were just mid. They were pretty mediocre, just very meh with a couple of positives. The problem now is they don't have a first round pick because they owe that to the Philadelphia Eagles, at least a top first round pick. They have a late first round pick, but they don't have that original first round pick. And they're still in the red. They are still in the red with money. It's going to make them hard to address a lot of their needs in the offseason. So honestly, I can again foresee things getting not just big hard, but even bigger hard, like San Quentin hard. Like that movie Get Hard. So it's going to get really big hard, and then not so easy for the Saints. Not just this offseason, but maybe even the next couple of off seasons, if we're looking at it right now. So halfway into this season recap part 2, I'd like to know your thoughts on all 3 of these teams that we talked about so far. The Raiders, the Falcons, and the Saints. What are your thoughts about them going into this offseason that's already started, and what do you think they're going to address or not going to address in the next week or couple weeks or the next all offseason long? I'd like to know your thoughts and what they should do. So let's continue along here. Let's now talk about the Kitties in Blue down in North Carolina. And that is, of course, the Carolina Panthers. So Carolina was not entering kind territory in 2022. They finished 2021 with a 5-12 record, and they didn't really address the two biggest offseason questions of all: head coach and quarterback. Why those two things? Well, for head coach, they had the micromanager in Matt Rule, the fool, still there. Why micromanager? Because, just look at the quarterback situation. Just look at how he ran that team in 2021. He still had Sam Darnold and PJ Walker on the roster, and they didn't exactly do great in 2021. And then they, for some reason, took on Baker Mayfield. They traded for Baker Mayfield from the Browns because, the Browns already got Deshaun Watson for a shit ton, and they made Baker Mayfield expendable. So, now they got Mayfield right before training camp, mind you. And Carolina's front office dipped their toes into big name quarterbacks like Deshaun Watson, Jimmy Garoppolo, and they failed before they settled on Mayfield. So it looked like another lost season for the Panthers because most didn't expect Carolina to make a playoff push. And there were a lot of people like me were just mostly concerned about whether Mayfield could resurrect his quickly dying days as an NFL starting quarterback. And, when was Matt Rule going to get fired? So for the Panthers, they went on to prove exactly why they should have ridded themselves of Rule the Fool last offseason as they started 1-4. You had a strong defense at least, because that's at least Matt Rule's specialty, because his and Ben McAdoo's game planning, though, on offense was really bad. Baker Mayfield continued to regress, as evident by his 2021 with the skid marks. In fact, Baker Mayfield progressively got worse to the point where he would get benched in the second half of the game against the 49ers for PJ Walker. The only thing good on that offense for Carolina was Christian McCaffrey, and he got traded before week 7 to the 49ers. So as such, after 2 straight home embarrassments to Arizona and to San Francisco, owner David Tepper finally had enough and fired Matt Rule, along with defensive coordinator Phil Snow after the 49ers loss. So it took an in-season firing of Matt Rule for David Tepper to have enough. So it's like, why couldn't you do that during the offseason last year? I don't know, but they finally did it. So in the interim, the rest of the way was his defensive passing game coordinator, and some of you may know that. He was a former head coach of the Arizona Cardinals, which was pretty shitty back in 2018, and Steve Wilkes. So PJ Walker would start a few games, but just like in his last few years, he wasn't much of a difference in leading the offense. Baker Mayfield would also start one more game against the Baltimore Ravens before he was released, paving the way for Sam Darnold, who was actually on injury reserve since the start of the season with the high ankle sprain. So Darnold also wasn't much of a difference maker in the passing game, but he at least did decently better at kind of protecting the football than PJ Walker and Mayfield ever did all season up to that point. And, he managed the offense okay-ish. Speaking of the offense, it was more so centered around a running back committee of Deontay Foreman, Raheem Blackshear, being heavily reliant on their top receiver in DJ Moore. They used him more frequently because, they don't have Christian McCaffrey anymore. Going back to the defense, they were a major reason why they stayed in the fight of, a crappy NFC South because, the Bucs absolutely were terrible in 2022. Defensive end Brian Burns did well in the trenches in run stopping and pressuring the quarterback. Linebacker Shaq Thompson also had himself another good year in both coverage and pass rushing. Second-year corner J.C. Horn also had a well year, leading the team in interceptions and defended passes, and a good amount of tackles too. The problem was for the Panthers, those early season losses and just the overall talent deficit, just piled on. And in a critical game in what was a de facto NFC South title game in Week 17 in Tampa Bay. They actually managed to, run up the score against Tampa Bay, but they allowed a signature Tom Brady comeback and eliminate themselves from playoff contention in that Week 17 game against the Bucs, and they wrapped up the season with a 7-10 record. A little bit of a shame for the Panthers, not really, but not much of a surprise though. Kind of a shame, though, that David Tepper didn't keep Steve Wilkes as a permanent head coach because he kind of rallied his team to an even 6-4 stretch prior to that matchup. They were kind of in striking distance of winning a shitty division. Sure, they wouldn't have won against the Cowboys. Well, certainly not. But, it would have inspired a little bit of confidence. But now they settled for former Colts head coach Frank Reich. Actually a good move for Carolina. You want to have an offensive head coach for whoever's going to be the next quarterback. And it seems like the Panthers may be a little committed to starting some kind of rebuild. Maybe. Who knows? But the problem now is you got to figure out how you're going to address some of your key needs, because looking at the offseason plan, they are a little in the red with their money. They're negative $9 million in cap space, so you have to figure out who to restructure and who could be a cap casualty. Looking at some of their key free agents, you have center Bradley Bozeman, kicker Eddie Pinheiro, and defensive tackle Matt Ioannidis. I can't pronounce last names, okay? So perhaps they managed to keep one or the other. But either way, I prioritize keeping Eddie Pinheiro because he was a solid kicker for them in 2022. You do have the 9th overall pick in this NFL draft. And, you should use it on a quarterback. Because the problem for Carolina is that prospect that they may want, it could not be there anymore. Along with the fact they still have a 3rd round pick they have Matt Corral on the roster, and they don't know what he's capable of. So if you're the Panthers and you see a top quarterback prospect that you like, whether it's at 9 or you trade up with whether it's the Bears or somebody else, you got to take it. You got to take what you get. If you see somebody, again, like I said just now, if you see somebody that you like at number 9, or what, if you trade up, you got to take it. You got to take a quarterback. It doesn't have to be the next Cam Newton or somebody that fits with Frank Reich, if that Frank Reich likes. Then you got to retool the offensive line because they can really block for shit, especially in the interior offensive line. And then you got to find a quality running back to replace the void. It doesn't have to be somebody like Christian McCaffrey, but somebody that can run really well. So, for the Panthers, they're entering an important offseason. Whether they want to make a wild card push or begin a rebuild, they have to answer one of those things. So that will be defined by how they approach free agency and the draft. But more importantly, they have to find a long-term answer at quarterback because it's been a revolving door since Cam Newton left in 2019. But overall, again, the most important thing is finding that quarterback. If Carolina wants to finally break through what honestly could be a wide open NFC South, considering that the Bucs are going through some household changes right now. But in order for Carolina to do that, to break through and perhaps compete in the NFC South, well, owner David Tepper, general manager Scott Fitter, and head coach Frank Reich all got to get together and hit the home run with the offensive side of the ball. And that starts with finding the answer at quarterback in the NFL draft. So the next team we're going to be talking about here in part 2 of our 2022 NFL season recaps is the Tennessee Titans. Now for the Titans, they were coming in to the 2022 season as the reigning, defending undisputed AFC South champions, the 3-time defending AFC South champions, but they were coming off a disappointing finish to end their 2021 campaign. Even though they got the top seed in the AFC, they lost to the eventual AFC champion Cincinnati Bengals in their first playoff game in the divisional playoffs. In the game where you saw Ryan Tannehill throw 3 key interceptions and Derrick Henry pretty much get shut down in that game. So you kind of had some questions about the quarterback position going into the offseason. And, well, they had themselves a notable offseason by answering some of those questions. And then some. Most notably, trading away their top receiver, A.J. Brown, to the Philadelphia Eagles, drafting his replacement in Treylon Burks from Arkansas, and then drafting a quarterback from Liberty in the 3rd round by the name of Malik Willis, all during the 2022 NFL draft. So a lot of moving parts in the offseason for Tennessee, and some questions revolving around whether or not Malik Willis at some point would surpass Ryan Tannehill as the starter. So, despite some turnover on offense, for as much as they had, the Titans, still remained the team to beat in the AFC South that was theirs to lose because, looking at the rest of the division, it wasn't that great, at least going into the season. But the regular season was pretty much a disaster from the start. They blew a 13-0 lead against the Giants, and then they got completely destroyed by the Buffalo Bills the game after. And that game against the Bills pretty much showcased what was to come for Titans fans and just overall all season long. Because even though, yes, they won their next 7 of 8 games, they pretty much won it in very uninspiring fashion. The offense, again, was very reliant on Derrick Henry. And, yeah, Treylon Burks showed a couple of flashes here and there. But, there was not really a go-to weapon in the receiving game. And Ryan Tannehill was, It's just, He pretty much regressed in 2022. And at times, yes, they showed flashes of aggressive plays and they jumped out to a big lead, but then they would get conservative and they nearly blew their games. So yes, they went they won their next 7 to 8 games, but again, in very uninspiring fashion. It was also during the stretch, in between the stretch, that rookie Malik Willis would make his NFL debut because Ryan Tannehill suffered a serious ankle injury in week 7. And yes, this was an injury that would end up plaguing him for the rest of the season. But in that game against the Houston Texans and a game against the Kansas City Chiefs, it appeared that Willis just wasn't ready yet to take the field. Most of his passes were shaky. Play designs often relied on his rushing ability. The Chiefs easily shut that down in that primetime game that they played against the Titans. And you kind of had some questions about Malik Willis and if he can potentially be a starter next season. Now by week 11, yes, they were 7-3 after beating the Green Bay Packers on Thursday night. But from that point on, they wound up losing the rest of the way. It wasn't just due to the stale offense, but a defense that was lacking in pass rush and pass defense. Keep in mind, they lost linebacker Harold Landry before the season even started to a torn ACL. They went on to get even worse with the injury luck with linebacker Bud Dupree and Zach Cunningham, as well as corner Caleb Farley, all getting injured late in the season. On offense, Ryan Tannehill would re-aggravate his ankle injury and would miss the last 3 games of the season. But the Titans wouldn't let Malik Willis start. They deferred that to signing journeyman free agent Joshua Dobbs. And unsurprisingly, he failed to do anything remotely positive, and the Titans wound up getting eliminated from playoff contention by the Jaguars, ending the season 7-10, and they finished with a league high 23 players on injury reserve. So, I'm just gonna say this, even had they beat the Jags in Week 18, was pretty much an AFC South title game, they still would have been ass whooped by the Chargers in the wildcard game. Fortunately for Titans fans, the head coach Mike Vrabel fired offensive coordinator Todd Downing along with offensive line coach Keith Carter, because they were just ass. They have been ass the last 2 years in terms of offensive scheme. And with Carter, the offensive line has been a mess. So replacing them are passing game coordinator Tim Kelly, who's replacing Todd Downing's role, and assistant offensive line coach Jason Hotoling, replacing Carter's role. So hopefully they can fix the mess that their predecessors did. When you look at the Titans going into this offseason, there are some things to address because, oh boy, because you have questions about, you have that same question regarding should Ryan Tannehill or Malik Willis start, and if they should release Ryan Tannehill, do they have faith in Malik Willis starting in 2023? That's something that they have to address. Otherwise, they're kind of in this holding pattern of like being mid. They're not terrible. They're not outright terrible, but they're especially considering that, Jaguars are potentially on the rise in the AFC. Not saying that they're like on the levels of the Bills, the Chiefs, and the Bengals yet, but you never know, because the Jaguars could potentially be a repeat AFC South champion, considering where Trevor Lawrence will be in year 3, in case of Doug Peterson, year 2 with the Jaguars. So the Titans kind of figured some things out. Looking at their offseason, they've already fired their previous general manager, John Robinson, during the season, perhaps for what he did for trading away A.J. Brown. And now they went on to replace him with former 49ers executive Ran Carthon. He's done a lot of quick work to get Tennessee under the salary cap, releasing a couple of key players that really would have gotten the Titans in the red. So looking at their cap space, they're around $11 million. So at the time of I'm making this podcast, so you have at least some flexibility to make some moves, in free agency. You also have, I believe, the 11th overall pick in the NFL draft. So perhaps you use that on a receiver, on another receiver, opposite Treylon Burks. So you're definitely going to need another receiver after trading away A.J. Brown. Looking at some of your key unrestricted free agents, you got David Long, Corey Levin, Nate Davis. Perhaps you want to re-sign Nate Davis at guard. Looking at some of your needs to address this offseason, you got to rebuild that offensive line, man. Especially the exterior. Taylor Lewan was missed most of the season with a knee injury. Pretty injury prone for the last 3 seasons, so you can't really rely on him anymore. The right tackle spot never really solidified. Whoever was at quarterback, and prone to quickly getting pressured. And they need to find 2 starters at both tackle spots. Like I said, you got to get at least 2 receivers to compete against Treylon Burks for that number 1 role. Burks has shown flashes though, but he was battling the injury bug and trying to adjust to the NFL. Maybe he has a breakout year 2, but either way, you got to at least find a number 2 and a number 3 receiver, and maybe even another number 1 with that 11th overall pick, because otherwise you're just going to leave the Titans passing attack nowhere to be found again in 2023, and defense is better targeting Derrick Henry. And you got to bolster up the secondary. They still lack at least 2 solid corners that could keep up with the opposing receivers, while they need another starting safety to go up and down the field with starter Kevin Byard. So you really got to lock down the downfield attack, the downfield defense. Otherwise, you're just going to get torched yet again. So overall, I guess I could say it clearly underestimated the loss of A.J. Brown would have on Tennessee, because it went on to worsen the problem the Titans would have the past few years in becoming too Derrick Henry centric on offense, because they ended up being much worse than I thought it'd be. So hopefully these new changes on offensive coordinator and the new general manager takes an offensive approach this free agency and the draft. And if it does, it'll be the addition that Tennessee needs to go beyond being just that generic offense in 2023. And the first thing they got to do, though, is figure out who's going to be the quarterback for the Tennessee Titans this coming fall. So what better way to cap off part 2 of our 2022 season recaps is, well, a team that is well known to be a skid mark on your underwear and on the toilet seat, and that is, of course, the Cleveland Browns. Of course, we like to call them here on Very Cold Lasagna, and well known worldwide as the Skid Marks, the Cleveland Skid Marks. And well, why were they the Cleveland Skid Marks yet again in 2022? Well, for the Cleveland Browns, the Browns 2022 offseason was very notable, but for all the typical skid marks reasons. Owner Jimmy Haslam and general manager Andrew Berry were stupid enough at the time last offseason to overpay the Houston Texans up the ass and trade up for their quarterback at the time, Deshaun Watson, for a shit ton of draft picks, which honestly the Browns could have done a couple years ago in the 2017 NFL draft with, well, the number 1 overall pick and get Deshaun Watson. But no, instead, they have to pay a shit ton of draft picks to go and get Deshaun Watson, including 3 first and third round draft picks, despite the uncertainty of his then ongoing sexual assault allegations and lawsuits. And I think there's still 2 that are still going on at this time. But most of the allegations and lawsuits were settled at the time. The NFL suspended Watson 11 games, leaving head coach Kevin Stefanski to make a game plan for backup Jacoby Brissett in the interim. And I predicted that if the NFL would suspend Deshaun Watson, at least for a good chunk of the season, then the skid marks were going to be competing for his playoff spot, not by a long shot. But instead, the Browns were expected to rather evaluate talent until Deshaun Watson came back. So when you look at this season, at least a little bit of fairness, yeah, the Browns were not going to be that good. But they also weren't that bad either. They also weren't really that terrible. They weren't really that typical skid marksy, in fairness. Yes, as expected, the offense was very run-centric. Nick Chubb was the Thomas the Tank engine to assure that Jacoby Brissett wouldn't have to shoulder too much. And in fairness to Jacoby Brissett, he actually did very solid in managing the offense. But, as seen for much of his career, he has his limitations. And even though the offense did okay at times, their defense had a lot of problems. They couldn't stop the run. Their corners were pretty bad. The secondary didn't know where the receivers were a lot of the times. As such, they lost a good amount of winnable games to start the season against the Jets, the Chargers, and the Ravens. A lot of blown opportunities to win it. It didn't help matters when you lose your linebacker, Anthony Walker Jr., early in the season to a season-ending injury, which weakened both the pass rush and the passing defense. So overall, yeah, the Browns, they weren't that great before Deshaun Watson came back, and it wasn't so great when he came back either. So I guess on a positive note, before we get into Deshaun Watson, Brissett, yes, he went 4-7 as a starter, but, he ended that period on a high note. He led the Browns to a comeback win against Tom Brady and the Bucs at home in his last start in Week 12. So, I guess that's good. I guess that's kind of good for Jacoby Brissett, to go out on that kind of note before the expected of the expected came. That time came for Deshaun Watson's debut in Week 13 in, of all places, Houston. He got that hostile ovation from whatever was left of the Texans fan base. And, from that point onward, it was all about how Deshaun Watson was going to look, how Deshaun Watson was going to play the rest of the way. As expected, he looked rusty because he hadn't played in almost 2 years, as he was underthrowing and overthrowing receivers, not recognizing pressure that Houston didn't have. Yeah, they won the game, but again, looked pretty rusty. But in Cleveland's final 5 games, he showed a little bit of flashes of his past self, but it's pretty evident that he looked really rough. 5 games was not going to be enough to establish a rhythm, shake off such rust. And as expected, the Browns were eliminated from playoff contention in Week 16 and ended the season at 7-10. So, yeah, I mean, obviously, the skid marks weren't going to go anywhere. But, I mean, in fairness, they weren't that terrible. But, again, not that great either. They're pretty mediocre. So the season finale in Pittsburgh also saw a culmination of the defense's season-long collapse beyond the already mentioned on-field issues. For the most part, I guess you could say, in short, they were lacking the discipline. Like players like Perrion Winfrey, Jadeveon Clowney, and even Myles Garrett. They were lacking the discipline. They either got benched, they didn't start games, or in the case of Jadeveon Clowney in the season finale, they were sent home. So head coach Kevin Stefanski made the choice to fire defensive coordinator Joe Woods and replaced him with former Lions head coach Jim Schwartz. So I don't know how that's going to pan out, but hey, you never know. So yeah, the skid marks still remain the skid marks, as if they weren't already skid marksy enough. So they're the skid marks that we all know and love again. But obviously, the main focus for them now is to hope that Deshaun Watson will have a full offseason to prepare. I mean, like I said, he still has like at least 2 sexual assault cases that he has to deal with. But they'll have to regroup and hope to attain better discipline and hope that Deshaun Watson will be ready to go with the full offseason for 2023. So for the Browns, they don't really have a lot of cap space to work with. At the time I'm recording this podcast, they were in the red. I'm not sure if they got under that, but not a lot of cap space to work with. They also don't have a first round pick, so not good for them either. So that it may work this year, but over time it's gonna start biting you in the ass. Looking at some of their key free agents, you have defensive end Jadeveon Clowney, strong safety Ronnie Harrison, linebacker Anthony Walker, corner Greedy Williams, and running backs Kareem Hunt and Dearness Johnson. So a lot of your starting defense going to free agency, unless if the Browns can restructure or make some other players cap casualties, then a lot of these players are going to be gone. I imagine Jadeveon Clowney is not coming back to the skid marks. Some of the things that they have to address in free agency, obviously, the interior defensive line needs work. They couldn't stop the run. They couldn't generate pressure inside, especially when Myles Garrett needed a shit ton of help. So they have to invest on not just the interior defensive line, but also on the opposite side of Myles Garrett, because just like with Aaron Donald and other players that are like star defensive pass rushers, like they can't do it alone. They need a supporting cast. So Myles Garrett could definitely use someone opposite of him, like on the other side, in order for the defensive line to really generate some heat on opposing quarterbacks. And, you know, they can definitely stand to get some receiving help behind Amari Cooper and Donovan Peoples-Jones, because, yeah, David Njoku was okay, but tight end, but it's like you don't really have that other third option to go to in the event that Cooper and Peoples-Jones are not doing well, and you need the third option to step up, especially considering that, you know, you want to know what you have in Deshaun Watson, like how he'll do in his like first full year as a starter. So for the Browns, yes, they were the skid marks that we all know and love again in 2022. But in fairness, they were pretty mediocre. Like, it's not really they were the skid marks that we all know to love because they lost so much. They were losing that many games in blowout fashion. Like, they suck to suck. I mean, not really this year. But they were the skid marks because they made a stupid decision to go get Deshaun Watson when he was in the midst of, you know, these legal these legal cases, and they made a stupid decision to go get him for for a lot of picks when they had him available at the number 1 pick in 2017. That's why. And also, it's Cleveland. So for the Browns, it's going to be very important that Deshaun Watson can at least show some like form, return to form this offseason in the offseason program and training camp and going into the regular season. If he doesn't, it's going to be very concerning, especially since they gave him a big fat contract. And if he doesn't show any sign of his prime days or when he was doing really good with a crappy Houston Texans team, then it's going to be serious trouble for the skid marks. That's going to be looking at that toilet seat saying, what is the shit that we just picked up in the 2022 offseason? Like, shit. Literally. And with that, that is a wrap on part 2 of our 2022 NFL season recaps. We talked about the Las Vegas Raiders, the Atlanta Falcons, the New Orleans Saints, the Carolina Panthers, the Tennessee Titans, and the Cleveland Browns. Everyone but the Raiders went 7-10, so we took a stroll down mediocrity road, and it was, just exactly how I described it. Mediocre as hell. So anyway, if you're a fan of these teams, either one of them, let me know. If you're a fan of them, let me know from your perspective how they did, and however you want to tell me in the comments on YouTube, if you're watching it from there, or if you listen on audio, leave a message, DM me on social media at Very Cold Lasagna on Twitter or Instagram. I'd love to know your perspective on your team, your personal team. Same thing with part 1. Let me know your perspective. But anyway, we got a lot more teams to cover here. We're almost halfway there. In part 3, we're going to talk about the almost was never enough teams, the 6 teams that almost made the playoffs, but unfortunately didn't make the cut. So stay tuned for that. Until then, that is it for this episode of Very Cold Lasagna. I am your filthy casual host, DylanLasagna, bringing you another set of filthy casual takes from this filthy casual place. And make sure to follow the show on Very Cold Lasagna on Twitter and Instagram. And listen however you can. YouTube, Apple, Spotify, Anchor FM, Google, however you want to consume it. And keep the lasagna very cold in the fridge with your takes on the world of sports. And until next time, peace out.